The best partner for creators. From Hoxton in East London, the latest from podnews.net with Supporting Cast, trusted by the biggest names to sell podcast subscriptions. Spotify's CEO Daniel Ek spoke to the Acquired podcast in a Spotify studio in Stockholm, focusing on podcasts. Ek describes why podcasts are in the main Spotify app rather than a separate one. And when asked if Spotify should pay podcast creators, he replies that the company's goal is to be the best partner for creators. We'll link to that today. Podscribe has added YouTube conversion modeling to its attribution service, with YouTube stats appearing in its unified dashboard. Want to know what's going on in the Chinese podcast scene? NPR Extra interviewed Yang Yi, the co-founder and chief operating officer of JustPod, and a prominent figure in China's podcasting and digital audio industry. Katie Price, a UK celebrity, has joined Crowd Network for a podcast later this year. She'll be speaking at the podcast show this Wednesday, as will I. Podcast Addict was subject to a denial of service attack over the weekend, pulling down podcast search and other services for the popular podcast app. It's fine now, though. Podfest will be on January the 25th to the 28th in Orlando, Florida, early next year at the Wyndham Orlando Resort in International Drive. Lex Friedman wants Twitter to become the best podcasting app. In response, Elon Musk suggests he uses Twitter Spaces. And in further reading, The Guardian has Fiona Sturgis looking at the phenomenon of the TV show Companion podcast and why it's seen recent success. And Tim Lowe has written about deliberately boring audio in Bloomberg. It's time for some tech stuff and writing a clever bit of redirection magic for your new RSS podcast feed. Apple Podcasts requires a valid file extension in the enclosure URL for your show to be correctly ingested, even if the enclosure URL is actually a redirect. Go on, ask us how we know. Anyway, the Livewire podcast validator has been updated to catch that. Also, while we're talking Apple Podcasts, you can add RSS URLs directly to the Apple Podcasts app. But if debugging an RSS feed, know that if the RSS URL appears in the Apple Podcasts directory, your app will use the version passed by central Apple Podcast systems and not the RSS feed directly. So add a cachebuster parameter on the end of the RSS URL to stop this from happening. And in the Podcasting 2.0 podcast this week, Mike Cadin from Red Circle joins as a guest, talking about dynamic audio insertion and the challenges it gives a podcast hosting company. And in podcast news, actor Rachel Bilson says she was fired for podcast comments she made about her sex life in Women on Top, which the press took out of context and, quote, put out as these clickbait headlines, as if we'd ever do such a thing. She didn't name the company she was fired from, though. Meanwhile, rapper Ice-T has also highlighted the issue of taking a comment out of context. Travelling to the podcast show, new podcast trailers will help you find a new podcast to listen to on the way. You'll find it wherever you get your podcasts. ARN's iHeart Podcast Network Australia has launched Your News Now, which they claim is one of the world's most advanced news podcasts in the world. The under 3-minute burst contains geo-targeted segments, including local weather. NPR's geo-targeted Consider This podcast launched in 2020. Those updated once a day, while Your News Now is updated every 6 hours. When you've booked a luxurious holiday away from it all, what's the best way to learn more about where you're going to stay? Why, a podcast, of course. Mount Cook Lakeside Retreat focuses on the story of a high country estate in New Zealand and is the first project from podcast company Story in Sound. And Manchester, Your Airport MAN launches today. It's Your Airport MAN, of course. It lifts the lid on the airport in the north of England. It's new from Crowd Network's new Crowd Branded division and explains how a busy airport that handles 30 million passengers a year works. This podcast is sponsored by Supporting Cast. What does Sony, Pushkin, APM, Slate, WNYC Studios, Savage, Lovecast, Q-Code and Tenderfoot TV have in common? They all rely on Supporting Cast to sell podcast subscriptions. Find out why at supportingcast.fm. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.